Sirach 10:6-18, the sin of pride. Do not get angry with your neighbors for every injury, and do not resort to acts of insolence. Arrogance is hateful to the Lord and to mortals, and injustice is outrageous to both. Sovereignty passes from nation to nation on account of injustice and insolence and wealth. How can dust and ashes be proud? Even in life, the human body is infested with worms. A long illness mocks the physician, and the king of today will die tomorrow. For when humans die, they inherit maggots and vermin and worms. The beginning of human pride is to forsake the Lord. The heart has withdrawn from its maker. For the beginning of pride is sin, and the one who clings to it pours out abominations. Therefore the Lord brought upon them unheard of calamities and destroyed them completely. The Lord overthrew the thrones of rulers and enthroned the lowly in their place. The Lord plucked up the roots of the nations and planted the humble in their place. The Lord laid waste the lands of the nations and destroyed them to the foundations of earth. He removed some of them and destroyed them and erased the memory of them from the earth. Pride was not created for human beings, or violent anger for those born of women. And second reading. Therefore, holy brothers and sisters, partners in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. Yet Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses, just as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that would be spoken later. Christ, however, was faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house if we hold firm and boldness and the pride inspired by hope.
Thank you, Betsy. Well, this is it. As I mentioned during the prayer time, this is the last Sunday of Pride Month for our friends and brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ plus community. But maybe it should be it, as in the last Sunday of the last Pride Month. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean just for our friends and brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ plus community. I mean any kind of Pride Month. Because it sure seems like when it comes to pride, God is, to borrow a popular expression these days, not a fan. Not a fan of pride. The book of Proverbs tells us pride goes before destruction, or as many of us know that phrase, pride goes before a fall. The letter of James says that God opposes the proud. Opposes. That doesn't sound good. And then there is the book of Sirach that Betsy just read from. The book of Sirach is part of a collection known as the Apocrypha. It's a group of Jewish texts that were written in Greek by Jews living in Greek-speaking parts of the Roman Empire. The word Apocrypha means hidden. Hidden from what? Thank you for asking. Hidden from the official canons of the Jewish and Christian Bibles, although valued by both. Fun fact number one for the day, though. At one time, the Apocrypha was considered to be officially part of the Christian Bible. What happened? Martin Luther happened. Martin Luther and the Reformers kicked the Apocrypha out because they were not part of the official Hebrew Bible. Oh, Martin Luther, that troublemaker. Fun fact number two. But this one only applies to the book of Sirach. Book of Sirach was written by Jesus. Not that Jesus. Not our Jesus. It was written by a man named Jesus, son of Eleazar, son of Sirach, which was shortened to Ben Sira. Ben Sira was a religious leader and the head of a school in Jerusalem that prepared young men for leadership in Jewish community. And he writes this book about 180 years before our Jesus arrives on the scene. And then 50 years or so later, his grandson translates it into Greek, which is how it is in the Apocrypha. And very much like the books of Proverbs and the letter of James that we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the book of Sirach is essentially meant to be a how-to manual. A how-to manual for living faithfully as God's people, whether it's as an individual, a community, or a nation. And in that regard, Ben Sira identifies a number of things that God is not a fan of. Things like hateful speech and dishonesty and the abuse of wealth and power. Things like retribution and even bad friends. And then, of course, quite clearly, as the passage that Betsy shared with us points out, God is not a fan of pride. The beginning of pride is sin, Ben Sira says. Now, that's kind of a weird sounding phrase, isn't it? You'd think that maybe he would have rearranged the words a little bit. You know, the beginning of sin is pride, or pride is the beginning of sin. But no. Because for Ben Sira, his spiritual understanding is that pride is the turning away from God. It is a heart, as he puts it, a heart removed from its maker. Heart in Near Eastern language, ancient Near Eastern language, representing the core of a person's being. And therefore, the beginning of pride then is sin. Sin understood as turning away from God and giving our primary devotion or putting our primary identity in someone or something else. A king, a ruler, our wealth, our possessions, our power, our prestige, our achievements, or even oneself. And Ben Sira says nothing good comes from that. That it leads us down the path to things like arrogance and insolence, extreme disrespect. It leads to the fall of kings and leaders and people and nations. It leads, excuse me, to exclusion and persecution. And so no, Ben Sira says, God is not a fan of pride. To which the writer of the letter of the Hebrews says, not so fast, Tiger. About 30 to 50 years after Jesus' death, an early Christian leader writes a letter, a sermon, really, to Jewish Christians living in Greek-speaking parts of the Roman Empire. Jewish Christians who are under stress, who are struggling to stay on their newfound Christian spiritual path. Struggling because they are facing increasing suspicion and persecution, imprisonment, the loss of property, a whole number of things at the hands of Roman authorities. And so this unknown Christian leader writes this letter to encourage those Jewish Christians, to exhort them to stay on the path, to stay faithful, to be faithful like their revered ancestor Moses was. And even more so, to stay faithful to the example that Jesus provided them as the embodiment of God and God's ways. As the writer puts it, the builder of the house here, a metaphor for the Christian community, for the church. Stay faithful to that identity, he says. Be the church, continue to be the house, and you can do that if, as he puts at the end of the passage that Betsy also shared with us, you hold firm, or as other translations put it, hold to the end, to the confidence and the pride that come from hope. The pride that comes from hope, or the pride that belongs to hope, other translations put it. So, God is a fan of hope? Well, it depends on the hope, on the pride. I'm sorry, God is a fan of pride? Yeah, it depends upon the kind of pride. This is a very unusual phrase. There's nothing else like it in the New Testament, this association between pride and hope. But for the writer of the letter of Hebrews, they are inseparable. Because for the writer, hope is rooted in and is the product of our identity, our primary identity, what should be our primary identity as human beings. Our identity as equally loved and valued people of God. Take pride in that, the writer says. Pride as in find your dignity and self-respect primarily in that identity. And not in the kind of pride that Ben Sira warns against. Pride as in feeling of one or one's group's superiority or special status in regard to other people or in the eyes of God. What Ben Sira and the writer of the letter of Hebrews are offering us then is a contrast between what psychologists and spiritual leaders refer to as unhealthy pride and healthy pride. And it is that healthy pride, that desire to find one's dignity and self-respect in our status as God's equally loved and valued people. That is the pride that, as I understand it at least, is at the heart of Pride Month for the LGBTQ plus community. The pride of dignity and self-respect in being equally loved and valued human beings. And sadly, the kind of pride that so many people, and even more sadly, so many Christians still want to deny those people. Why? Well, of course, the most common reason given is, well, it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible. God says a man shall not lie with a man. Bible says God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. You have no idea how much I hate that expression. Yes, those things are in the Bible. But one, you can find at least one thing in the Bible to support basically any position you want about anything you want. And two, as biblical scholars like Dana Nolan Fuel and Walter Brueggemann and a host of others have tried to advise Christians, you cannot take those texts or any text in the Bible out of their historical and cultural context. They must always be looked at with two vital considerations. First is our ancient Jewish ancestors and early Christian ancestors had no conception of being gay or lesbian as a part of someone's makeup, as a part of who they were as a human being. And secondly, a couple of the primary verses that Christians love to point to condemn that population, particularly ones from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, those were written. They were written during a time in which the ancient Israelite community was coming out of exile in Babylon. A time when they were desperate to rebuild and repopulate their community. And so those verses had as much, if not more, to do with that need for procreation than anything, and not a condemnation of LGBTQ plus people. But there's a third consideration that I would like to add. What are the patterns? What are the patterns of the Bible? As I just said, you can find at least one verse to support anything you want in the Bible. But what are the patterns? What are the consistent patterns that the Bible talks about when it comes to sexual relationships or relationships in general? Their fidelity, honesty, integrity, and a refusal to exploit or abuse. Those are the patterns. And despite what so many Christians would like us to believe without a shred of evidence, members of the LGBTQ plus community are no more prone to violating any of those things than anybody else. And that is because they are no more and no less human than anybody else. But I also wonder if beyond the "it's in the Bible" thing, there isn't something else going on there. Maybe, perhaps, unhealthy pride. Unhealthy pride. The desire, the need to feel superior to feel that one has a more special status among other people or with God. That natural inclination that we as human beings have to look at people who are different from us in some way and categorize and then treat them as less than. Then Sirach and the writer to the letter of Hebrews, in their different ways, are pointing us in the same spiritual direction and towards the same spiritual and psychological and social truth. That while there is nothing inherently wrong with being proud of or taking pride in our achievements or our possessions or our artistic or academic or athletic abilities, while there is nothing inherently wrong with taking pride in those things or with taking pride in our race or our ethnicity or our religious or political or sexual orientation, while there is nothing inherently wrong with any of that, there is something wrong when we make any of those things our primary identity. The most important thing about us than what Ben Sirach and the writer of the letter of Hebrews say is, in truth, the most important thing about us. Our status as equally loved and valued people of God. The fact that, as the writer of the letter of Hebrews puts it so beautifully in that first verse, that we are welcomed, all of us, welcomed and invited by God to be partners in a heavenly calling. How about that? Isn't that a great phrase? That we are all equally called to be partners in a heavenly calling. And that, my friends, is the one thing that God is certainly a fan of. No bigger fan of. Amen. I invite you to stand for our closing hymn. Please be seated. And are there announcements from the community today? Tom, an update?
Does that work? Significant events this week, but before I comment on that, we're going to be updating the congregation every 2 or 3 weeks. I think it is important that